There is a moment somewhere in the middle of regular show's run where a character gets hit so hard he coughs up a small amount of blood, and the camera lingers on it, and Cartoon Network aired it during the afternoon without a word. Most people who watched it at the time were 11 or 12 years old, sitting cross-legged on a carpet, and they probably just accepted it the way children accept everything on television, which is completely. But go back and watch it now, and something shifts. You realize the show was always doing this, always pushing right up to the edge of what a children's network would permit, and sometimes past it, and almost nobody has sat down and gone through all of it in one place. Tonight, we're doing exactly that. Every controversy, every moment the network blinked, every piece of content the show had to walk back or defend or quietly bury. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, we'll be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, it really does help us keep going. Regular show ran for 8 seasons on Cartoon Network between 2011 and 2017. It was created by J.G. Quintel, who had studied at the California Institute of the Arts and who had already worked on Cartoon Network productions including The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack and Camp Lazlo before getting the green light for his own project. The show followed Mordecai, a blue jay, and Rigby, a raccoon, both in their early 20s, both working as groundskeepers at a park managed by a gumball machine named Benson, alongside a cast of supporting characters including Skips, a Yeti with an eternal lifespan, Pops, a lollipop-headed man of extraordinary gentleness, Muscle Man and his best friend High Five Ghost, and Margaret and Eileen, the 2 main love interests across the show's run. On the surface, it was a show about slackers doing their jobs badly and getting into supernatural trouble. Below the surface, it was something else. It was a show about young adulthood, about the specific low-grade dread of feeling like your life is not going anywhere, about male friendship under pressure, and about the strange things that happen when you mix that emotional register with genuine cosmic horror. And right from the very beginning, that combination created friction. Let's start at the start, which is the only place that actually makes sense. The pilot for regular show, which Quintel developed as a student short at CalArts, was called 2 in the AM PM. It aired publicly in a limited context and was later made available online, and if you go and find it now, it is immediately obvious why it was never going to air as a children's program on a children's network, in the form it existed. The short follows 2 gas station workers who take a large amount of tablets that turn out to be stimulants and then experience a hallucinogenic collapse into something that is genuinely disturbing to watch. The figures distort, the voices go wrong, the geometry of the scene bends in ways that feel less like animation and more like a bad experience with a substance you were not supposed to take. The implication of drug use is not subtle. It is the entire premise. The short was never hidden, but it was also never presented as the foundation of the children's show that followed. And that gap between where the show came from and where it ended up is one of the central threads running through every controversy we are going to cover tonight. Quintel did not pretend the short did not exist. In interviews, he discussed it openly, framing it as a student exercise and as the original seed for what became Mordecai and Rigby, because the 2 lead characters in that short are recognizable ancestors of the 2 we came to know. Their relationship, their dynamic, their shared tendency toward escalation and bad decisions, all of that was already there. But the content of the short meant that when the network gave Quintel the show, a question was baked in from the first day of production. How much of this sensibility would survive the transition to afternoon programming for children? The answer, over 8 seasons and 261 episodes, turns out to be quite a lot of it. The show was, from its inception, designed to operate on 2 frequencies simultaneously. On one frequency, it was a cartoon for kids about funny talking animals getting into trouble. On the other frequency, it was a show for people in their late teens and 20s who had grown up watching Cartoon Network, and who would recognize in Mordecai and Rigby's paralysis and avoidance, an inability to grow up, something that looked uncomfortably like themselves. The creators were open about this dual audience. Quintel talked about wanting the show to feel like a natural successor to the kind of animation he had loved as a kid, which was itself often edgier than people remembered. But that dual audience strategy created a specific kind of pressure, because what works tonally for a 22-year-old watching late at night is sometimes not the same thing that the standards and practices department of a children's television network wants airing at 3 in the afternoon. The show spent 8 years negotiating that tension, and the negotiation was not always clean. The clearest early example of this tension, the one that people who were paying attention noticed in real time, involves violence. Not cartoon violence in the classic sense, the kind where a character gets flattened by a boulder and pops back up unharmed. Regular show used that language too, but it also used violence differently, in ways that acknowledged weight and consequence in a register most children's animation avoided. Characters in the show got hurt in ways that looked like they hurt. The blood moment I mentioned at the opening is real. It is documented, and it was not the only one. There are multiple episodes across the show's run where the physicality of injury is treated with more seriousness than you typically see in the genre. The network's internal standards document, which was not made public, but which has been discussed by crew members in interviews and in behind-the-scenes commentary over the years, had specific rules about what was and was not permissible in terms of depicting pain. Regular Show pushed those rules consistently. The response from standards and practices was not always a hard no. Sometimes it was a negotiation. Sometimes a scene would come back with notes that resulted in a subtle reframe, a cut that happened a frame earlier, a reaction shot that redirected the viewer's eye before the impact registered fully. The show got good at finding those cuts. What is interesting, and what gets lost in the simple framing of the show as a controversy machine, is that the violence was almost never gratuitous in the sense of being purposeless. When Regular Show depicted something painful, it was usually in service of an emotional point. The show was genuinely trying to say something about consequences, about the way bad decisions compound, about the reality that the world does not reset between episodes the way a lesser show might let it. That intention did not always protect it from criticism, but it does matter when you are trying to understand what the show was actually doing. Let us talk about something more specific. There is an episode in the show's run. I am not going to give you a season and episode number I am not certain of, and the show's episode ordering in various databases sometimes differs from broadcast order. But the episode is called Muscle Woman, and it concerns Muscle Man's complex romantic life, specifically an ex-girlfriend who shares his general physique and who the episode treats as a figure of physical comedy. The humor in that episode relies almost entirely on the joke that a heavyset woman is inherently funny to look at, and it does so without any of the self-awareness or complication that might have redeemed it. It is a straightforward, fat joke stretched across a single episode, and in the context of everything else the show did, it stands out. This is one of those cases where the controversy is less about a single decision and more about what the decision reveals. Regular Show, for all of its genuine sophistication in other areas, had a complicated and not always defensible relationship with bodies, specifically with the way it coded certain body types as inherently ridiculous. Muscle Man himself, the character who works at the park alongside Mordecai and Rigby, is funny partly because of how he looks, and the show acknowledged this explicitly through his own meta-humor about his appearance. He makes jokes about his own body constantly. There is an argument that this is self-deprecating comedy being performed by a character who owns it, and that argument has some merit. But the Muscle Woman episode does not give the female equivalent of that character the same complexity or the same agency. She is not in on the joke. She is just the joke. The show received criticism for this from multiple directions, and the criticism sharpened over time as the cultural conversation about body image in media became more precise and more pointed. The production team did not, as far as public record shows, issue any formal response to this criticism. The episode continued to air. But it is worth noting that as the show progressed, this specific flavor of humor became less prominent. Whether that was a deliberate creative choice or simply the natural evolution of a show, finding its feet is hard to say from the outside. The question of gender representation in Regular Show is bigger than any single episode and runs through almost the entire series as an ambient controversy rather than a flashpoint. The show's core cast, Mordecai, Rigby, Benson, Skips, Muscle Man, High Five Ghost, and Pops, is almost entirely male. The two most prominent female characters across most of the show's run are Margaret and Eileen, who exist in the early seasons primarily in relation to Mordecai and Rigby's romantic interests in them. Margaret is the coffee shop girl Mordecai has a crush on. Eileen is the slightly awkward friend who Rigby eventually warms to. Both characters develop significantly over the course of the series, and the show does give them interior lives and ambitions that are independent of their relationships with the male leads. But the structural fact of a nearly all-male ensemble with women largely in support roles was something critics noticed and commented on throughout the show's run. What makes this genuinely interesting, rather than just a checklist item, is that Regular Show seemed, at various points, to be aware of this critique and to be trying to address it without entirely dismantling the structure it had built. Margaret's storyline involving her journalism career and her departure from the park setting to pursue something larger is a good example. The show does give her a trajectory that is about her own life rather than just about Mordecai's feelings. Eileen becomes a substantially more fleshed out character as the seasons progress. Starla, Muscleman's eventual wife, goes from being a one-note figure to having her own episodes and her own emotional depth. None of this fully resolves the structural critique, but it does suggest a production team that was listening, or at least that was not entirely indifferent, and that is a more honest reading of the show than either the full defense or the full condemnation. Now let us go somewhere that makes people more uncomfortable, which is the show's relationship with alcohol. Regular Show is set in a world where the characters are adults, even though the show airs to children. The show never pretended otherwise. Mordecai and Rigby are in their early 20s. Benson is a working adult with a job he cares about. The characters exist in a register of young adult life that includes going to concerts, dealing with difficult bosses, navigating romantic rejection, and occasionally going to a bar. The show depicted alcohol, specifically beer, not constantly but regularly enough that it was a recurring element of the setting, particularly in the later seasons when the adult life themes became more prominent. This created a specific tension with Cartoon Network's standards, because depicting characters drinking beer on the children's network is exactly the kind of thing that generates complaint letters and occasionally draws the attention of parent advocacy groups. The show handled this in an interesting way. In the early seasons, the beer was largely implied or shown in ways that were ambiguous enough to survive a quick standards and practices review. Characters would be shown at a bar or holding bottles without the content of those bottles being made explicit. As the show progressed, and the characters aged narratively, the depictions became more direct. The clearest expression of this is the relationship between Muscleman and drinking. Muscleman is a character who reads across his entire arc as someone who has a complicated relationship with substances, specifically with the kind of social drinking that slides almost imperceptibly into something heavier. The show never states this directly. It would not have been able to, on the network it aired on, but the coding is there for adult viewers who are looking for it. The way Muscleman's behavior fluctuates, the way his emotional volatility is connected in specific scenes to social contexts that involve drinking, the way his character is written as someone who uses performance and loudness as a shield for something quieter and more fragile underneath. None of this is confirmed by showrunners in interviews, but it is a reading the show invites, and it is the kind of double coding that becomes controversial when viewers start pulling on the thread. There was never a formal controversy around the alcohol content in the same way there was around, say, a single specific episode that caused complaints. But it accumulated. There is a cluster of complaints in the public record, sourced from parent advocacy forums and from the Parents Television Council, which was at various points during the show's run an active commentator on Cartoon Network content, that specifically cite Regular Show's treatment of drinking as irresponsible for its time slot. The show's response, to the extent there was one, was the same response it gave to most of this kind of pressure. The creators continued doing what they were doing, with minor adjustments at the margins when the network pushed back on specific scenes. This brings me to something that is more documented and more specific, which is the show's ongoing battle with Cartoon Network's Standards and Practices Department over the word pissed. This sounds minor until you understand the context. Pissed, meaning angry, is a piece of British English that had been in common use in American speech long enough to be basically unremarkable to most adult ears. It is not a word that most people would flag as inappropriate in any meaningful sense. But Standards and Practices for Children's Television operates on a different scale of sensitivity, and the word contains the root of a word that refers to urination, and that was apparently sufficient to put it in a gray area on Cartoon Network. J.G. Quintel has discussed this in interviews. The show wanted to use the word in dialogue, specifically in the context of a character expressing anger, and this required a negotiation with the network. The negotiation was apparently not straightforward. Multiple exchanges were required. The word was reviewed and rejected and reviewed again. The final outcome depended on context and delivery, and the show did eventually get the word into broadcast episodes, but the process of getting there was described by people involved as more labored than anyone would have predicted for a single two-syllable word. This is funny, but it is also revealing. The Standards and Practices process at a children's network operates at a level of granularity that most viewers never see, and the fights that production teams have to have are often over things that seem, from the outside, completely disproportionate. Pissed became a proxy battle for a larger disagreement about tone and register, about whether Regular Show was going to be allowed to sound like adults talking, or whether it was going to be forced into the softer, more rounded language of traditional children's television. The fact that the show won that particular argument, and similar small arguments over and over again, is part of why it sounds the way it does. Every instance of natural adult register in the dialogue is the result of someone on the production side having fought for it. The more significant language controversy involves something that is almost certainly what you are thinking of if you followed the show's production history at all, which is the strong language that made it through broadcast in ways that appear to have been accidental. There are moments in regular show's run, documented by viewers who paused and rewound, where something that sounds like a word that would not ordinarily be allowed on afternoon children's television seems to slip through in a way that is ambiguous enough to survive a standard review. The ambiguity is the point. These moments are not clearly and definitively anything. They are sounds that the human auditory system in context fills in with meaning. Whether any of them were intentional is not confirmed. Whether any of them were flagged internally before broadcast is not known from public sources. But they exist in the record, and the online fan communities that catalog them are substantial and detailed. This kind of thing has a long history in animation, where the medium allows for a kind of plausible deniability that live action does not. A word that is blurred by music or half obscured by a sound effect can be argued to be something else entirely. And in the context of a review process that is handling hundreds of minutes of content across a schedule that includes dozens of shows, the margins for things slipping through are real. Regular show benefited from those margins more than once. Let me move to something that sits in genuinely different territory from the production process controversies, which is the show's engagement with actual horror. Regular show was not classified as a horror show, but it contained horror content that was substantive and genuine, and that in several episodes pushed into territory that would not have been out of place in programming aimed at adults. The Entity episode, which I am describing by its colloquial fan name because its actual title varies slightly across databases, and I do not want to give you a wrong episode number, concerns a spirit or force of such fundamental wrongness that the episode's treatment of it crosses from spooky into something that sits closer to cosmic dread. The visual design of the entity in question, the way it moves, the sounds associated with it, the framing of the encounter, these are not cartoon horror conventions. They are actual horror conventions applied to a children's animation format. This kind of content generated a specific flavor of complaint from parents who had put their children in front of what they understood to be a cartoon about talking animals, and who then had to deal with a child who could not sleep. This is documented in complaint logs from Cartoon Network's Viewer Services Department, which are not publicly available in full, but which have been referenced in reporting on the show's content reviews. The network took these complaints seriously enough to review the episode and to implement slightly tighter guidelines around horror content in the show going forward. But the show was never pulled or formally sanctioned over any horror-adjacent episode. The reason for this is interesting. The horror in regular show was, almost without exception, thematically justified. It was not horror for shock value. It was horror deployed in service of the show's consistent concern with mortality, with the weight of the past, with the way certain things cannot be undone. The show's treatment of Skips, specifically his immortality and the grief that immortality entails, is the clearest example of this. Skips has watched people he loved die. He has outlived everyone. That is a genuinely dark premise, and the show never softens it past a certain point. And when the show reaches into horror to make that premise felt, the horror is appropriate to the emotional weight it is carrying. The standards and practices of reviewers, to whatever extent they engage with this argument, appear to have found it persuasive, at least partially, at least often enough for the show to continue operating in the register it had established. The horror content never disappeared. It modulated, sometimes got louder, and sometimes quieter. But it was there from the first season to the last. The first season contains what is probably the single most discussed content controversy in the show's entire run, which is the episode in which Mordecai and Rigby play a video game that is explicitly coded as an analog for drug use, in ways that recall and deliberately echo the CalArts short that preceded the series. The episode is called First Person, and it involves a video game that Mordecai and Rigby become so absorbed in that the absorption becomes physical, hallucinogenic, dissociative, something more than a simple gaming addiction metaphor. The visual language of the episode is borrowed directly from the grammar of depicting altered states, and the show deploys it with the confidence of a production team that knows exactly what they are doing. This episode was reviewed by Standards and Practices. It aired, it was not pulled. But it generated a significant volume of online discussion, primarily among adult viewers who recognized what the episode was doing, and among parents who were disturbed by what their children had watched without those parents having any particular warning about its content. The episode became a touchstone in the ongoing conversation about what regular show actually was, whether it was a children's show with adult elements, or an adult show that happened to be airing in a children's slot. Quintel's answer to this question, given across multiple interviews, was consistent. It is a show for young people, including young adults, and it is made with the sensibility of someone who remembers being a young adult and who is not interested in talking down to that audience. That answer is honest and it is defensible, but it did not fully satisfy critics who felt that the show's time slot carried an implicit promise to parents, a promise that the show sometimes strained. Let us talk about the episode that is generally considered the most outright controversial single episode the show produced, which is the one that aired during season 3, and which concerns a character engaging in behavior that the episode presents with a level of graphic detail that surprised even the show's regular audience at the time. The episode I am referring to is the one commonly called Slam Dunk, though I am using the fan shorthand rather than making any claim about the precise episode catalog position. And it involves a competition between characters that escalates into violence that the show depicts with considerably more realism than its visual style would normally suggest. The sequence that drew the most attention is one in which a character suffers an injury that the camera holds on in a way that reads as deliberate, where the show is making a point about the reality of the injury rather than eliding it for comfort. This is the instance of blood I mentioned at the very beginning of this script. It is not the only moment of its kind in regular shows' run, but it is the one that seems to have generated the most specific response from Cartoon Network's internal review process, because it is followed, in the episodes that come after it, by a perceptible shift in how the show depicts physical injury. Not a complete change, but a modulation. The camera begins to cut away slightly earlier. The aftermath gets slightly less screen time. It is the kind of adjustment that only becomes visible if you are watching closely and across enough episodes to have a baseline. This matters because it represents something relatively rare in animation controversy history, a show that demonstrably modified its behavior in response to internal pressure, not in a way that involved public acknowledgement or a formal statement, but in a way that is visible in the work itself. The show changed, and the show changed in response to something. The something was not only the blood content, it was also part of a broader conversation happening at Cartoon Network during this period about the overall tone and approach of its more experimental programming. Adventure Time was going through similar conversations at the same time. The network was navigating a complicated moment, where the shows that were generating the most cultural attention and the most devoted older audiences were also the shows that were most consistently testing the limits of what a children's network could program. The solution the network arrived at, across multiple shows, was not a hard reset, but a recalibration, a set of informal guidelines that were communicated through the notes process rather than through formal mandates. Regular show responded to this recalibration by finding new pressure points. If the physical violence was going to be watched more carefully, then the show would invest more in psychological horror, in emotional darkness, in the kind of content that sits below the radar of a content review process, focused on visible physical harm. This is not speculation, it is visible in the show's creative evolution across the middle seasons, where the horror elements become less graphic and more atmospheric, where the darkness is achieved through implication rather than depiction. There is something genuinely impressive about this, considered as a craft decision. The show got more frightening by becoming less explicit. It trusted its audience to fill in the spaces it was no longer allowed to show directly, and the audience did exactly that. I want to stay with the horror content for a moment before moving on, because there is a specific cluster of episodes that sits in territory that no other children's animation show of that era came close to, and it deserves its own attention. The episodes involving the show's mythology of the park, specifically the episodes that deal with what lies beneath the park, what the park's history actually is, and what larger forces the park exists within, constitute a sustained piece of horror writing that is remarkable regardless of the format it is delivered in. The show builds, over multiple seasons, a picture of the park as a place that sits at the intersection of supernatural forces, where the ground beneath the lawn that Mordecai and Rigby spend their days maintaining is connected to something much larger and much older. The revelations about Skip's past, the true nature of certain threats the characters face, the cosmology of the universe the show inhabits, these are not the elements of a light afternoon cartoon. They are the elements of something more like a mythology, and the mythology has a genuinely dark center. The controversy around these elements was less about specific episodes and more about cumulative effect. Parents who watched a few early episodes and concluded that the show was a lighthearted comedy about a gumball machine managing some young adults were, when they encountered the mythology content, experiencing something that felt like a bait and switch. The show's visual style, its humor, its brisk pacing, none of these prepared an uninitiated viewer for the depth and darkness of what the show was building toward. The tonal contrast was itself a kind of content issue. The show was aware of this and in some sense was using it deliberately. The darkness lands harder because it is unexpected. The horror registers more fully because the baseline is comedy. This is a legitimate craft choice, one with a long history in the genre of dark comedy and in horror fiction more broadly. But it meant that the show was constantly operating with a kind of tonal whiplash that not everyone found comfortable, and that some viewers, including parents and some critics, experienced as a form of manipulation. I think there is a conversation to be had about whether that feeling of manipulation is a fair description, or whether it is the natural response of a viewer whose expectations were formed by a simpler version of what the show turned out to be. But the feeling itself is real, and it was widely reported, and it belongs in any honest accounting of what the show stirred up. Let us talk about something that is in some ways more interesting to me than any of the content controversies, which is the show's handling of its own adult themes in the emotional rather than the physical register. Specifically, its handling of depression. Mordecai across the show's run is a character who exhibits consistently and with increasing clarity as the seasons progress the behavioral markers of someone who is managing a mood disorder. He is avoidant, he self-sabotages, he is capable of great warmth and connection, but retreats from it at the moment it becomes real. His relationship with Margaret, which drives a substantial portion of the show's emotional arc, is complicated by his inability to close the distance between what he feels and what he is able to act on. He knows what he wants. He cannot make himself take it. This is not a character quirk. It is a clinical pattern. The show never names this. It is never presented as a storyline about depression or anxiety, because that kind of direct naming was not something the show's format supported, and was probably not something that standards and practices would have approved in the context of an afternoon children's program in the early 2010s. But the show depicts it. It depicts it accurately and with a kind of specificity that suggests the writers were drawing on real experience. And the depiction reaches the audience because one of the most consistent themes in fan discussion of regular show, stretching across the entire decade since the show ended, is the recognition of Mordecai's emotional patterns by viewers who share them. This is something that sits at a strange angle to the usual controversy framework. There is no single episode that generated complaints about Mordecai's emotional depiction. There is no documented standards and practices review of his characterization as a potentially harmful model for young viewers. The controversy, if you want to call it that, is ambient and diffuse. The show was depicting something real and painful and true, and some people found that powerful and useful, and others found it concerning. And the line between those two responses is not always clear from the outside. What I find genuinely remarkable about this element of the show is that it existed alongside everything else, the comedy, the supernatural adventure, the cosmic stakes, and never required the show to stop being funny or light or entertaining. The depression or depression-adjacent state was not a theme episode. It was woven into the texture of the character, present in his every scene, and the show trusted its audience to feel it without requiring a flag or a label or a moral. Whether a children's television show is the right place for that kind of material is a question I find genuinely difficult. There is an argument that it is exactly the right place, because children and young adults who are experiencing those feelings often encounter them first in the figures they see on screen. And having a figure who feels that way and is still functional, still funny, still loved by his friends, is potentially more useful than a dedicated public service announcement. There is a counter-argument that a show without the tools to address the material responsibly should not be using the material at all. I do not think either argument wins cleanly. What I know is that the show put it there and millions of people felt seen by it. And that is not nothing. Rigby's arc carries a different weight and generated its own set of responses. Rigby is, in the early seasons, almost entirely coded as an irresponsibility, is funny because it is escalated by supernatural circumstances. He lies, he avoids work, he manipulates Mordecai, he makes bad decisions with impressive consistency. The show is funny about this, but as the seasons progress and Rigby's backstory is filled in, specifically the revelation about the way his relationship with Mordecai was affected by decisions Rigby made around their transition to adulthood, the comedy starts to carry more weight. Rigby did something real, something that had real consequences, something that Mordecai did not know about for years, and when it comes out, it reframes everything that came before it. The handling of this storyline attracted attention specifically because of the way the show balanced accountability and forgiveness. Rigby is held responsible for what he did. Mordecai's anger, when he finds out, is presented as legitimate and proportionate. The show does not rush to a resolution or soften the impact, but it also, over time, works towards something that looks like genuine reconciliation rather than just the declaration of it. And the way the friendship is depicted post-revelation is different from before in ways that are specific and earned. Some viewers felt the resolution came too easily. Some felt the show let Rigby off the hook. Others felt it was one of the most honest depictions of how real friendships survive real betrayal that they had seen in the format. All of these responses are represented in the documented fan record, and none of them is obviously wrong. This is the kind of material that generates lasting discussion precisely because it does not resolve cleanly. And a show that does not resolve cleanly is a show that is doing something interesting. The romantic arcs in regular show are worth their own section, because they were a consistent source of controversy that operated at a level separate from the content review process, living primarily in the fan community and in critical discourse rather than in formal complaint mechanisms. Mordecai's relationship with Margaret is the show's central romantic storyline for most of its run. It is slow, it is complicated, it is realistic in its hesitations and misses, and near misses in a way that romantic storylines in children's animation almost never are. The show takes the feelings seriously. It does not use them only for comedy. When Mordecai confesses something to Margaret, or when she leaves, or when the relationship reaches a new stage or retreats from one, the show gives those moments emotional weight. Then the show introduced a new love interest for Mordecai named CJ, short for Cloud Jane, in a way that split the audience sharply. Part of the audience had invested deeply in the Mordecai-Margaret dynamic and experienced the introduction of CJ as a betrayal of that investment. Part of the audience welcomed a new dynamic and found CJ a more interesting character than Margaret had been allowed to be. The debate between these two camps was substantial and at points heated. What is interesting here is that the production team was apparently navigating real creative disagreement internally about this arc. There are suggestions in interviews and behind-the-scenes accounts, though these are not fully sourced in formal production documents that are publicly available, that the writers were not entirely unified on how the Mordecai romantic arc should resolve. The decision to give Mordecai a new love interest at the series' conclusion, one who was neither Margaret nor CJ, was controversial even among people who had been broadly happy with the show's romantic storytelling up to that point. The ending of Mordecai's romantic arc felt to many viewers like a retreat from the emotional investment the show had built, a resolution that resolved nothing it had actually raised. The show's finale, and I will get to it in more detail later, received mixed responses partly for this reason. The epilogue format, which shows where the characters end up many years after the events of the final season, was appreciated by many viewers as a generous gesture toward closure, but the specific content of Mordecai's ending was widely discussed as unsatisfying given everything that had come before it. Whether that is a failure of execution or a deliberate choice to leave the emotional questions open is again something that cannot be definitively answered from outside the writer's room. CJ as a character sits at an interesting intersection of the show's various controversies. She is a better developed female character than the show had managed in its earlier seasons. She has her own emotional complexity, her own arc, her own version of the show's central question about what you do when you are young and uncertain and the world is not cooperating with your sense of yourself. Her relationship with Mordecai is depicted with honesty, including the ways Mordecai's avoidance and self-sabotage damage something that could have been good. The ending of their relationship is one of the show's more painful sequences, and it is painful in the right way, the way that comes from recognizing the truth in something, rather than from being subjected to a shock. But CJ also attracted criticism that is harder to dismiss, specifically around the episode in which her powers, she is a cloud person who can generate storms, are activated by jealousy, and depicted in a way that codes female anger as dangerous and uncontrollable. The show eventually addressed this, and CJ's control over her powers becomes part of her arc, but the initial depiction sat uncomfortably with viewers who had already been critical of the show's handling of its female characters, and it added to a record that, taken as a whole, suggests a production team that was trying harder than it had been earlier, but was still getting things wrong with enough regularity to matter. I want to take a moment to talk about the show's relationship with nostalgia, because it is relevant to several of its controversies in ways that are not immediately obvious. Regular show is saturated with the 1980s and early 1990s. The music, the visual aesthetic, the cultural references, the very texture of the show's world, all of this is built from a specific era of American popular culture, the era of arcade games and VHS tapes and action movies with practical effects and synthesizer scores. This was a deliberate, creative choice, and it was also deeply personal for Quintel and the team around him. They were making a show about their own childhood world, translating it into the present tense, giving it to a new generation. The nostalgia was genuinely infectious. It is a large part of why the show found the adult audience it found. People who had grown up in that era recognized what the show was doing, and felt seen by it in a way they were not expecting from a cartoon on a children's network. The show was a preservation project as much as an entertainment project. But nostalgia is also selective, and the things it selects for are not always the things that hold up. The 80s and 90s contained attitudes toward gender, toward race, toward bodies, toward sexuality that were mainstream at the time and that are not mainstream now. Regular Show's nostalgic recreation of that era sometimes reproduced those attitudes, along with the synthesizer music and the VHS grain. Not always, not in every episode, but enough times that the pattern is visible. The most direct example is the show's relationship with homophobia, which is present in the show's early seasons in small doses that were, at the time of broadcast, probably not flagged as problematic by most of the production team's internal review, and which read very differently now. There are jokes in the early seasons that derive their comedy from the idea that two men being affectionate is inherently funny or uncomfortable. There is a register of specifically masculine discomfort with intimacy that the show deploys as humor in ways that have not aged well. This is not unique to Regular Show. It was a pervasive feature of animation from this era, including Adventure Time and many other Cartoon Network shows. But it is there, and it has been noted by critics and by fans who returned to the show after it ended. The show's relationship with this particular element of its early tone is interesting because it evolved. The later seasons are noticeably different in this register. The male friendships in the show, particularly Mordecai and Rigby's relationship, become more openly tender over time, and that tenderness is not played for comedy or for discomfort. High Five Ghost's storyline in the later seasons involves a romance that the show treats with the same warmth it brings to any other relationship in the show. Whether this evolution was a deliberate corrective or simply the natural growth of a production that was itself growing up is hard to say, but the arc is visible. There is a specific incident involving the show's treatment of the subject that is documented more precisely than the ambient tonal issues, and it involves an episode that was in production during the later seasons and that went through a revision process related to its depiction of a romantic relationship. The details of what was changed and why are sourced primarily from crew members speaking informally rather than from official statements. And so, I am going to keep my account of it at the level of the general. There was an episode. The episode had content related to a relationship that the production team wanted to depict in a certain way. Standards and practices intervened, and the episode changed. This is the kind of story that recurs throughout the show's production history, and that represents the constant negotiation between what the creative team wanted to make and what the network was prepared to air. The network's position on LGBTQ content in its programming during the period when Regular Show was in production was complicated and changed over time. In the early 2010s, Cartoon Network standards on this were restrictive. By the mid-2010s, they had shifted, reflecting both broader cultural change and the network's own evolving sense of its audience and its responsibilities. Regular Show's production history spans this shift, and the show's content reflects different points on that shifting timeline depending on which season you are watching. Adventure Time, which aired on Cartoon Network concurrently with Regular Show, is the more prominent example of a Cartoon Network show navigating this shift, specifically through the Marceline and Princess Bubblegum relationship, which was implied across many seasons before being made explicit in a later season, and then in the finale. Regular Show's version of this story is less prominent and less documented, but it exists in the record and it belongs to the same history. Let me talk about the show's music content because this is an area that generated a specific and unusual kind of controversy. Regular Show used licensed music more extensively and more creatively than almost any other animated show of its era on a children's network. The show's soundtrack is a genuine artistic achievement, a curation of rock and synth and funk and pop from the late 70s through the 90s that functions as a second language for the show's emotional and tonal content. The music does not just play in the background. It is integrated into the scenes in ways that use specific songs to say things the dialogue is not saying. That use the feeling of a particular piece of music to establish a register that the show then inhabits. The controversy around the music is not about what the music expresses exactly. It is about the songs themselves, specifically about the lyrics and associations of certain songs used in certain contexts. There are songs in Regular Show's soundtrack that are associated in the public consciousness with the culture of substance use. There are songs that are associated with sexual content in ways that are not obvious to a child viewer, but that are immediately recognizable to an adult. There are songs whose association with adult themes is diffuse enough to survive a content review. Since a reviewer checking whether a song is appropriate for children's television is generally checking the lyrics rather than the cultural context, but which function as a kind of signal to older viewers that they are watching something that is not quite what it is presented as. Whether this was intentional subversion or simply the taste of a production team that loved this music and did not overthink the implications is genuinely unclear. Quintel and the writers have spoken about the music as purely aesthetic and nostalgic in origin. But the pattern is consistent enough across enough episodes that the idea of pure coincidence feels insufficient as an explanation. There were specific instances where the music choices drew formal complaints or internal reviews. There are accounts from people who worked on the show of notes from the network about particular cues, of replacements being made in certain cases, and of the originals surviving in others. The specifics of which songs were changed and which were not have not been formally documented in sources I can point to with confidence, so I will not name titles and make claims I cannot verify. What I can say is that the show's music is one of the places where the layering of meaning that defines regular show is most visible, where the show is most clearly doing two things at once, and that this layering was noticed and discussed and occasionally contested throughout the show's run. The Season 6 content is worth its own discussion because it represents a sustained creative push that was received very differently by different parts of the show's audience and that generated more critical controversy than almost any other section of the show. Season 6 of regular show aired in 2014 and 2015, and it is the season in which the show's scope expands most dramatically, most literally. The season involves the characters spending an extended period in space, which seems like a straightforward adventure premise, but which the show uses to push several of its thematic concerns to extremes they had not reached before. The mortality content, the cosmic horror, the questions about what remains when everything familiar is stripped away, all of this becomes louder and more insistent in space than it had been in the park. The response to this was divided. Fans who were invested in the show's mythology found the space content exhilarating. Fans who were primarily there for the character dynamics at the park found the season alienating. A departure from what had made the show work, a reach for epic scale that sacrificed the intimacy that had been the show's real strength. Critics were similarly split. The season was praised for its ambition and criticized for the way that ambition sometimes overwhelmed the character work. What makes this a controversy rather than just a difference of opinion about creative direction is that the debate about Season 6 reflected a genuine uncertainty about what kind of show regular show was and was supposed to be. The show had always been two things: a character comedy and a cosmic adventure. The space season pushed hard on the cosmic adventure side, and many people felt the character comedy was a casualty. The show did not fully recover the balance until the final season, by which point it had to do a lot of work very quickly to get the characters back to a place where the ending could land with the emotional weight it needed. The finale itself is something I want to spend real time with because the finale of regular show is one of the most emotionally serious conclusions any children's animated show has ever attempted, and it generated a response that mixed deep love with deep controversy in ways that are still being argued over in fan spaces years later. The show's final season is structured around an escalating threat that is personal, cosmic, and metaphysical simultaneously. The villain of the final season, Anti-Pops, is the mirror of Pops, the lollipop-headed man of extraordinary gentleness who has been a background figure of warmth and innocence throughout the entire series. The revelation that Pops is at the center of a cosmic struggle, that his destiny is connected to the fate of the universe, that the park and everything in it has been oriented around this single point of contact between opposing forces. This is a mythology payload that the show had been building toward across 8 seasons and that lands with real force. The controversy around the finale operates on several levels. The first and most obvious is the death of Pops. Pops dies in the finale. He dies deliberately, sacrificing himself to end the conflict with Anti-Pops, and the show does not soften this. The death is depicted with full emotional weight. The other characters grieve. The show does not cut away from the grief. It sits in it, it holds it, it refuses to resolve it too quickly. This is remarkable for a children's animated show, and it was praised widely as such. But it also generated a specific flavor of distress in younger viewers who were not prepared for a finale that ended this way, and the complaints that came in were, by some accounts, more numerous and more heartfelt than anything the show had received in response to its more surface-level controversies. This is the deepest version of the show's central tension. Regular show, at its most serious, was doing something that needed to be done in the format of children's animation. It was saying that things end. It was saying that people we love die. It was saying that the world continues, that the friends we made along the way are still there, that the park is still there, but that some things are gone and do not come back, and that this is the shape of being alive. That is a true thing. It is an important thing. It is a thing that children need to encounter, in some form, because the alternative is leaving them without any preparation for the real experiences that are coming. But the objection that the finale was too much, too heavy, too real, for a show that had also spent 8 years being a comedy about a gumball machine, that objection is not without merit either. The question is whether the show had earned the weight it tried to carry at the end, whether it had built the architecture carefully enough over 8 seasons to support what the finale asked of the viewer. I think it had. I think the groundwork was there, but I understand why people who felt blindsided by the endings register experienced it as a kind of betrayal. The second level of finale controversy is the epilogue. After Pops' death and the resolution of the cosmic conflict, the finale jumps forward 25 years and shows where each character ended up. This epilogue was widely praised for its warmth and its specificity, for the genuine care it took with each character, for the way it honored what the show had built over 8 seasons. But Mordecai's ending, which shows him having become a painter and having married an anthropomorphic bat character who appears only in the finale's closing minutes, was experienced by a substantial portion of the audience as a deflation. The Mordecai romantic arc, which had been one of the show's most sustained emotional commitments, involving years of investment in his relationships with Margaret and then with CJ, ended with neither of those characters. The show introduced a new partner for him in the final moments and gave her no development, no history, no context within the show's world. For viewers who had spent years caring about those relationships, this felt like the show shrugging at its own emotional architecture. The defense of this choice, which was made in statements from Quintel and other writers after the show ended, was that the point of Mordecai's arc was never about which specific person he ended up with, but about whether he could become someone capable of being in a relationship at all, and that the new character was meant to signal that he had finally got there, had finally become the person who could close the distance. That is a coherent, creative argument, but it required the audience to abandon an investment the show itself had cultivated, and not everyone was willing to do that. I want to move to the controversy around the show's treatment of Benson, which is smaller in scale than the Mordecai arc, but which touches something genuine. Benson is, across the show's run, depicted as an antagonist to Mordecai and Rigby, in the sense that he is their boss, and he demands that they do their jobs. His anger is played as comedy. His frustration with the two protagonists is framed as an obstacle to be overcome. The show positions him as part of the establishment against which the show's slacker protagonists are implicitly rebelling. This is a common comedy structure, and it works well in the early seasons. But as the show develops, it also develops Benson as a character in ways that complicate the simple antagonist reading. We learn about his history, about what he wanted before he ended up managing a park, about the compromises and disappointments that shaped him into what he is. We see him in relationships that are taken seriously. We see him caring about the people he works with, including Mordecai and Rigby, in ways that are genuine rather than merely obligatory. The show eventually arrives at a version of Benson that is sympathetic in a way that the early seasons' comedy depended on him not being. The controversy here is subtle and was mostly discussed among older fans rather than generating formal complaints or network intervention. It has to do with what the show's treatment of Benson says about the way it frames authority and work. In the early seasons, the joke is that Benson cares about the job and the protagonists do not. And Benson caring about the job is somehow ridiculous, the mark of someone who has given into a system that the cool characters resist. As the show matures and we understand Benson better, this reading becomes less comfortable. Benson is not ridiculous for caring about his work. He is a person who found meaning in a role that the show initially coded as beneath the interest of anyone worth caring about. This is the kind of thing that only comes into focus in retrospect, when you watch the show as a whole rather than episode by episode. The show grew past its own initial framing, and in doing so, it created a mild but real tension between what it said about work and responsibility early on and what it seemed to say by the end. Let me address the content concerning the episode Sky Island, or the episodes in the Sky-based arc, and the broader controversy around the show's depiction of heaven and afterlife content. Pops comes from a world above the park, a world of cotton candy and gentleness and quasi-magical existence. And the show is not always careful about the extent to which this world maps onto various religious traditions' conceptions of paradise. The content in these episodes was reviewed by Standards and Practices and aired without major modification, suggesting the network did not find the overlap problematic enough to flag. But the complaints from viewers who felt the show was trivializing specific religious concepts did reach the network's mailbox, and they were not trivial in number. This is an area where children's animation has always been navigating difficult territory. Any show that reaches into the register of the sacred or the quasi-sacred, or even just the afterlife adjacent, is going to touch something that someone holds deeply and personally. Regular Show's version of this material was handled with genuine affection and genuine seriousness, without being satirical or dismissive. But the mere act of depicting these concepts in animation, on a children's network, in a context that mixes them with comedy, was enough for some viewers to find it objectionable. There were organized letter-writing efforts to Cartoon Network at specific points in the show's run regarding this content. The network's response was, as far as public record shows, to acknowledge the letters and to note that the content had been reviewed and approved. The show continued. The question of religious content in animation is one that does not resolve tidily, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The people who found this content offensive were not being unreasonable in the sense of applying an idiosyncratic standard. They were applying a standard that a large number of people share. The show was not trying to hurt them. It was trying to tell a story that touched on things that touch on religion without being religious content, and that is a genuinely difficult needle to thread. Now I want to talk about something that is in some ways the most interesting controversy the show produced, because it is the one that is hardest to frame as a mistake. Regular Show made an episode that, depending on how you read it, is either a sophisticated piece of media criticism aimed at the adults watching the show, or a piece of content that should not have aired in its time slot, or possibly both simultaneously. The episode in question, which I am going to describe carefully because the details matter, involves a character encountering a force that is explicitly coded as an addiction. The force offers pleasure, immediate gratification, relief from discomfort. The character pursues it with escalating intensity. The behavior pattern is familiar. The consequences are familiar. The show depicts the arc of addiction with specificity that goes beyond metaphor into something that reads as documentary in its accuracy. And it does all of this within a supernatural comedy framework that allows the show to pass the content review process while delivering something that, to the appropriate audience, is clearly about something real. This was not an isolated creative choice. It was part of a pattern in the show of using the supernatural adventure format to discuss things that the format of children's animation would not ordinarily accommodate. The show discussed grief and loss and mortality and failure and the specific pain of being young and feeling like the world is not making room for you, all through the grammar of cartoon adventure. The addiction episode is part of this pattern. The controversy it generated was of a particular kind. A significant number of parents watched it and had no idea what their children had just seen. But a significant number of those same children understood exactly what they had just seen and found it useful. That split response is documented in online discussions from the period of the episode's broadcast, where adult fans of the show were simultaneously alarmed by the content and grateful for its existence. The episode gave people tools to talk about something that they did not have the words for, which is what the best content in any medium does. Whether a children's network is the right place for that content is the question that does not resolve. I have my own view, which is that if you are going to make content for young people that tries to prepare them for the world they are going to live in, then the things that content needs to address include the things that are going to hurt them, including the things that are real and dark, and not susceptible to a clean narrative resolution. But I hold that view lightly because I know it is contested, and because the people who contested are not wrong to do so. The show's relationship with its parent company's commercial interests generated a small but interesting controversy that is worth noting. Regular Show, like all Cartoon Network shows, existed within a commercial ecosystem. Merchandise was produced. The show was licensed for products ranging from clothing to video games to theme park appearances. The show was also, in its later seasons, subject to the kind of corporate pressure that comes with being a significant revenue-generating asset rather than just an artistic endeavor. The show's creators, in retrospect, have spoken about the ways this pressure manifested, about conversations regarding extending the show beyond the point where it made creative sense, about requests related to keeping certain character dynamics accessible for merchandise rather than allowing them to evolve in the directions the writing naturally pointed. These accounts are not highly specific in public documentation, and I am not going to attribute specific statements to specific people when the sourcing is not clean. But the general shape of this story, a successful animated show facing pressure to maintain commercial accessibility at the cost of creative development, is one of the most common stories in the history of animation on children's networks. And there is no particular reason to think Regular Show was exempt from it. What is notable is the extent to which Regular Show did manage to evolve, did follow its characters through genuine arcs, did arrive at an ending that was true rather than commercially convenient. The show was extended beyond 8 seasons at various points through its network life in terms of order expansions, but it was also allowed to conclude on something that felt like a real conclusion, rather than an arbitrary cancellation. And that is not guaranteed for any show in this environment. Let us talk about the show's treatment of mental health content beyond Mordecai's arc, because there are threads here that were not controversial in the sense of generating formal complaints, but that are worth examining. High Five Ghost is a character who spends most of the show's run in the background, defined primarily by his friendship with Muscle Man and his general good-naturedness. In the later seasons, the show gives High Five Ghost a romance and an individual arc, and in doing so, it reveals a character who is more complex than his background role had suggested. The arc includes elements of loneliness and social isolation that are depicted with enough specificity to read as something more than narrative scaffolding. Muscle Man's arc is perhaps the most direct treatment of emotional health in the show's entire run, and it is one that I find genuinely affecting. Muscle Man is introduced as a character whose defining trait is a specific kind of aggressive performative masculinity. Constant jokes about his body, constant loud assertions of his own greatness, constant maintenance of an image that is designed to repel intimacy. The show slowly reveals what is underneath this performance, and what is underneath it is someone who lost his father young, who has a complicated relationship with that loss, and who uses the performance as a way of keeping the grief at a distance he can manage. The episode that deals most directly with this grief content was produced late enough in the show's run that the audience was already invested in Muscle Man as a full character rather than a joke delivery mechanism. And the episode lands because of everything that came before it. The grief is real in the episode. The performance of toughness that breaks in the face of grief is real. The way the other characters receive his vulnerability is real in a way that the show had earned the right to depict, because it had spent years establishing what those friendships actually were. The controversy around this content, to the extent there was one, was the same ambient controversy that followed all of the show's more emotionally serious content. A children's show was doing something that children's shows are not supposed to do, and some people found this wonderful, and some people found it inappropriate, and most people just found it true. The show's finale and the events leading up to it were also accompanied by a production controversy that has been discussed in animation circles and in the fan community, which concerns the pace at which the show's creative team learned the show would be ending and the time they had to prepare for it. The accounts of this vary and are based primarily on informal statements from crew members rather than documented official communications. So, I will keep this at the general level. The show's final season was produced under time pressure that was significant enough to affect certain creative choices. And there are elements of the final season, particularly in its pacing and in the development of certain character arcs, that bear the marks of a production that was moving faster than it wanted to. This is a common feature of animation production, where lead times are long and changes in network plans can create sudden compression that the creative team has to absorb without being able to fully account for. The finale's quality is not diminished by this, in my reading. The show did what it needed to do in the time it had. But there are things in the final season that might have been developed more fully, given more time. And the production circumstances are part of why. I want to spend time on the controversy that sits for me at the most interesting intersection of the show's themes and its production context, which is the controversy around the show's ending and what it meant. Regular Show ended in 2017 with a finale that was, as I described, serious and moving and ambitious. It ended a show that had run for 8 seasons. That had grown from a premise that was in some ways a vessel for slacker comedy into something that was genuinely about what it means to be alive and young and uncertain, and to find, in the specific texture of your friendship with specific people, something that holds. It ended with a death and with grief, and with a vision of the future that was warm rather than triumphant. That was about the small, specific ways in which the people we love continue to matter to us long after the circumstances that brought us together have changed. The controversy around the ending is not that it was bad. Most people who watched it agreed that it was good, often that it was more than good, that it was the show making good on everything it had promised across 8 seasons. The controversy is about what the ending revealed about what the show had been doing all along. The ending of Regular Show is a show about mortality, not just in the death of Pops, but in its entire structure. The show is about the fact that being young does not last, that the specific form of life you are living when you are young, the specific texture of your days, the specific quality of your friendships, these are not permanent. They change. They end. Something remains, but it is not the same thing. The park will still be there. The friends will still be there, changed and older. But the specific young adult world that Mordecai and Rigby inhabited will be over, and you cannot get it back. This is the show's actual subject, and having watched the show on children's television for 8 years, many viewers arrived at the finale and found the subject staring them in the face in a way they have not been fully prepared for. The revelation was not a spoiler exactly. The show had been pointing at this all along, but the finale made it unavoidable in a way that the individual episodes had not, and that landing hit different for different people depending on where they were in their own lives. Adults who had watched the show since its beginning and who are now in their late 20s or early 30s found the finale almost unbearably resonant. The show had grown up with them. It had aged at something close to the pace they had aged, and arriving at the end together had the quality of a real farewell, a real acknowledgement that a particular phase of life was over. Younger viewers who had encountered the show later, who came to it without the shared timeline, found the finale more emotionally direct, and in some cases, too much so. The distance was different. The resonance was of a different kind. This is not a failure of the show. This is actually exactly what the show was trying to do. It was trying to make something that would mean different things to the same person at different points in their life, and it succeeded at this more completely than almost anything else in the children's animation format. The controversy is simply that some people did not want a children's cartoon to do this to them. They wanted the comedy and the adventure and the nostalgia, without the weight, and the show by the end was not able or willing to give them that. Let us cover a few things that exist in the show's record that do not fit neatly into the categories we have been moving through. There is the controversy around the show's portrayal of Canadian characters, which is a small but genuine entry in the record. The show includes characters at various points who are coded as Canadian through specific stereotypes, specifically through excessive politeness and a certain softness of affect. And the comedy derived from these portrayals was noted by Canadian viewers and cultural critics as relying on a caricature that, while much gentler than other national stereotypes deployed in animation, was still a caricature. The show's response to this was essentially to continue, though the portrayals became less pronounced in later seasons. There is the controversy around specific merchandise decisions, where products associated with regular show were criticized for content that seemed to target the adult fan base in ways that were potentially inappropriate given the show's nominal audience of children. The specific products in question are not important, but the dynamic is, a show with a dual audience creates a dual market, and the merchandise ecosystem that develops around that market is not always calibrated carefully to the distinction between the two audiences. There is the ongoing discussion about the show's treatment of authority figures across its run. Benson and Pops are the central authority figures at the park, and the show's relationship with both of them evolves over time. But the early seasons' framing of Benson as an obstacle, and the later seasons' reframing of him as a full human being, so to speak, created a message about authority and work that was genuinely mixed. The show started out saying, in effect, that caring about your job is the mark of someone who has given up on something larger, and ended by showing that the person who cared about the job was carrying grief and hope and love in exactly the same quantities as the protagonist who had dismissed him. Whether that journey constitutes a resolution of the mixed message or just a juxtaposition of two contradictory messages in sequence is something that viewers are still discussing. There is the controversy around the show's specific cultural references, and whether those references being drawn from an era that preceded the show's primary child audience constituted a form of cultural gatekeeping, of implicitly telling younger viewers that they needed to know a certain history to fully appreciate what they were watching. This critique is real, but it applies to much of what is most interesting in animation from this era, and it is worth noting that the show was not hostile to viewers who did not share its specific cultural frame. The references enriched the show for those who got them. They did not exclude those who did not. This is the correct way to use reference as a creative tool, and the show used it correctly almost always. And there is the controversy around the show's legacy and what it means for children's animation more broadly. Regular show changed what children's animation could be. Not dramatically, not in a single visible rupture, but incrementally and persistently over 8 years of consistently doing things that the format was not supposed to be able to do. It told stories about grief and loss and addiction and depression, and the specific pain of young adulthood with the kind of care and accuracy that those subjects deserve. It did this in a context that required constant negotiation with commercial and institutional interests that were not always aligned with the creative vision. It got things wrong, sometimes badly, and it got things right, often remarkably. The controversies we have covered tonight are not incidental to the show. They are part of its story. Every argument about what the show was allowed to do, every battle over a word or a frame or a piece of music, every complaint letter, and every standards and practices review, and every audience response, all of these are part of what the show is. The show was made under pressure. The pressure was part of what gave it its specific texture. There is a specific kind of bravery required to make something that is going to generate complaint letters, that is going to create friction with a network's internal review process. That is going to land with some part of its audience in a way that feels like too much, and to make it anyway because you believe it needs to exist in the form it wants to exist in. Quintel and the team around him exercised that bravery across 8 seasons, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but persistently and with genuine conviction. The show's influence on the animation that came after it is visible in dozens of shows that followed. Shows that took the permission regular show had won for dark themes and adult emotional register in children's animation and used it to build their own versions of that space. The debt is rarely acknowledged directly because creative lineage in animation is complicated and the conversations that would make it explicit are not usually public. But the space exists and regular show did significant work to make it available. I want to end with something that I think gets at the heart of why this particular show's controversies matter. Regular show was always, underneath everything, a show about what happens when you are young and you do not know what you are supposed to be doing with your life. And the world keeps moving, and the days keep passing. And you are still there at the park, still cutting the grass, still dealing with the same boss and the same friends and the same fears you have been carrying since the first day, and somehow, imperceptibly, things are changing anyway. The show understood something about that specific experience that almost nothing else in the format understood, and it used every tool available to it, comedy and horror and adventure, and music and visual style and narrative structure, to get that understanding onto the screen. Every controversy the show generated was, at some level, a controversy about whether that understanding was welcome in the specific space it had chosen to occupy. The answer the show gave, 8 seasons long, was that it was welcome whether it was welcome or not. That the things worth saying are worth saying even when the saying creates friction, and that the audience that needs to hear them is usually the audience that has not been warned to expect them. That is a good answer. It is, in fact, the best answer. If you are still here, thank you for spending the night with this. The show meant a lot to a lot of people, and I am glad there is a place to take it seriously. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I will see you in the next one. Before we get to the end, there is a great deal more to cover, and I want to make sure we do it properly. Let us go back to something that deserves more space than I gave it earlier, which is the show's production history at a technical level and the ways that production history created controversy, not in the visible content, but in the decisions that shaped the content before it ever reached an audience. Regular show was produced at Cartoon Network Studios in Burbank, California, and the production pipeline it used was standard for the era, with storyboarding, writing, and animation each occupying distinct phases of production, with long lead times between them. This structure means that a decision made in the writer's room in 1 month might not reach broadcast for 6 months or more, and by the time a piece of content airs, the conversations that shaped it are well in the past. The people who made those decisions are already deep into making something else. The relationship between intent and reception is always mediated by this time lag, and it is one of the reasons why creators of animated shows often seem out of step with their audience's response to specific content. By the time the audience is watching an episode, the people who made it have already moved on, and the ability to course correct in real time is limited. For regular show, this production lag was a significant factor in some of the show's most discussed content controversies. The blood content in the episode I described earlier, for example, was not produced in a moment when the production team was consciously testing limits. It was produced in a moment when the team was in a creative flow that felt natural from the inside, and by the time the episode aired and the response came in, the production had already moved forward considerably. The modification I noted, the perceptible shift in how physical injury was depicted in subsequent episodes, required the writers and directors to adjust a flow that was already in motion, which is harder than adjusting it before it starts. This is relevant to the controversy around what some fans have described as inconsistencies in the show's content standards across its run. Moments where the show seems to apply different levels of intensity to similar material in different episodes. Those inconsistencies are real, and they are largely a function of the production structure rather than of deliberate choices. A show with a long lead time and a large team will have variation in how individual creative decisions land, because the decision and its context are separated by months by the time anyone can evaluate the result. The show's showrunner structure changed over its run. J.G. Quintel remained the creator and an executive producer throughout, but the day-to-day management of production shifted and evolved. Different seasons have perceptibly different tones, in part because of who was most directly managing the production at a given time. The later seasons, which many fans consider the most emotionally sophisticated, were produced under a configuration that gave more room to the longer character arcs and the mythology content that the earlier seasons had established but not fully committed to. Whether this configuration reflected a deliberate, creative decision or the natural evolution of a production, finding its identity over time is hard to assess from outside. But the tonal shift between early and late seasons is real, and it matters. Let me talk about the episode-level controversies that I have not yet addressed in detail, because there are several that deserve individual attention. The episode called "The Best Burger in the World" aired in the second season of regular show and deals with Mordecai and Rigby's efforts to obtain a legendary burger that is available only once per year. This sounds straightforward, and in most respects it is. But the episode contains a sequence in which Benson's rage upon discovering what Mordecai and Rigby have done is depicted with a level of emotional intensity that generated complaints from parents who felt it was modeling an unhealthy expression of anger for their children. The specific concern was not that Benson's anger was unjustified. He is entirely justified in the episode, but that the way the show depicted that anger, the visual language of his physical reaction, the sounds associated with it, the way the other characters respond to it, felt to some viewers like it was glorifying or normalizing explosive rage. The show's position, implicit rather than stated, is that Benson's explosiveness is itself part of a character whose lack of control in this area is something the audience is invited to understand as a problem, as something Benson himself is managing imperfectly. The comedy depends on recognizing this as a problem, but the criticism that the depiction itself, regardless of framing, models behavior that children might imitate is a real criticism and not a naive one. Children do not always decode framing the way adult viewers do. They observe behavior and they know what that behavior produces in narrative terms, and if the production is not careful, the note they take is not the one the writers intended. This is a general problem in comedy animation and not unique to regular show, but the show's tendency toward escalation meant it encountered the problem more often than a gentler show would have. The escalation is part of the show's comic logic, which requires that situations get worse before they get resolved, and often much worse before they get resolved. The worse they get, the more they tend to involve behavior that is taken in isolation, not behavior you would want modeled for a young audience. The show handled this by insisting on consequences. This is the thing that separates regular show from the purely consequence-free comedy of a simpler format. Things in this show have aftermath. Benson's rages do not simply reset at the end of an episode. They accumulate. The show builds a picture of someone whose management style is creating real damage in his workplace relationships. And by the time the show reaches the middle seasons, and Benson begins to genuinely change, to become more moderate, to develop actual warmth toward his employees, the change is credible because the pattern it is changing from has been documented across multiple seasons. That arc is one of the show's genuine achievements. And it is also one of the things that creates the controversy I am describing, because the arc requires that the problem be established at full intensity before the change can mean anything. There is an episode in the third season that I want to address specifically because it has been discussed in the fan community with a level of intensity that suggests it hits something real. The episode concerns the revelation of information about one of the main characters' pasts that recontextualizes their behavior across the preceding seasons in a way that the show had not prepared the audience for. I am being deliberately general here because the episode's impact depends on not knowing what is coming, and I would rather you experience it than have me tell you. What I can say is that the episode's handling of this revelation was considered by many viewers, including critics, to be too abrupt, too dramatic, insufficiently set up by what came before it. The argument is that the show was moving in a direction it had not laid the groundwork for. I disagree with this reading, and I will tell you why. The groundwork was there. It was just distributed across episodes that were not individually flagged as significant in the way that a deliberate piece of setup would be flagged. The show was not signaling that it was building toward this. It was trusting the audience to hold the pieces and to feel the shift when the piece that connected them was placed. That is a higher trust form of storytelling than most children's animation uses. And some of the criticism of the episode is actually criticism of the show for expecting more than a certain kind of viewer was prepared to give. This does not mean the criticism is wrong. It means the show was making a choice that created a specific kind of risk. The risk of a viewer who arrives at the revelation without the context that makes it feel earned, and who experiences the gap as a failure of craft rather than a demand for engagement. The show made that choice, and the controversy that followed was part of the cost. Let us talk about the show's relationship with death in more detail, because death is a recurring presence in regular show, and the way the show handles it is both one of its most praised features and one of the consistent sources of the complaints I have been tracing. Death in regular show is not the cartoon death of a show that resets between episodes, where characters fall from great heights and shake themselves off and are fine. Death in this show is real. When it happens, it stays. The show's world has a mechanism for this in the form of characters who are immortal or quasi-immortal, like Skips, which allows the show to dramatize the weight of loss from the perspective of someone who has experienced it repeatedly across a very long life. Skips carries the grief of everyone he has ever lost. The show returns to this weight regularly, and it does not lighten it for the audience's comfort. The death of characters the audience has been invested in, when it occurs, is handled with a seriousness that was at times more than parents anticipated. There are episodes in the show's run where secondary characters who have featured in multiple episodes die in ways that are not reversed, not undone by the end of the episode, not treated as a temporary narrative condition. The show asks the audience to grieve and to continue, which is what grief actually requires. And the ask was too much for some viewers. The standard criticism of this content follows the same logic as the criticism of the horror content. The show was promising one thing and delivering another, and the gap between the promise and the delivery was the problem. I think this framing misidentifies where the failure lies, if there is a failure. The show was never promising something gentle. It was promising something adventurous and funny and true. And the truth part included death. The people who found themselves surprised by this were not reading the show wrong exactly, but they were reading it incompletely. There is a specific episode involving a character named Gary, and a circumstance that I will not describe in detail for the same spoiler reasons I mentioned before. That prompted more documented complaints than almost any individual episode in the show's run. The complaints were not about the violence of what happened or about graphic content. They were about the emotional impact on children who were not prepared for it. The letters to Cartoon Network, as reported in accounts from people who worked at the network during this period, were coming from parents of young children who had watched the episode in good faith and had then had to deal with children who were upset about something real. This is worth dwelling on because it represents something genuinely complicated. The show was not trying to hurt those children, but it did in the specific sense that it introduced them to something painful before they were equipped to handle it. Whether that is a harm or a valuable developmental experience is a question that does not have a universal answer because it depends on the individual child, on the presence or absence of adults who can help them process what they felt, on the broader context of their lives. The show had no way of calibrating for that. No show does. What the show could have done, and what some of its critics felt it should have done, was to frame these moments more carefully, to give the audience more warning, to mark the emotional weight of what was coming so that viewers could prepare. The counter-argument, which the show seemed to have subscribed to, is that the weight of mortality is precisely something you cannot fully prepare for, that the impact of loss depends on it being unexpected, and that a show that telegraphed its deaths would be teaching the wrong lesson about how loss actually works. I find this argument more compelling than I expect to. The show's treatment of death is honest in ways that most fiction is not, because most fiction gives you time to make your peace with what is coming. Regular show does not always give you that time, and the deficit is instructive. Now I want to address a category of controversy that is harder to talk about precisely because it involves the fan community rather than the production. And the line between the show's responsibility and the fan community's behavior is genuinely blurry. Regular show, like any show with a devoted adult fan base, generated a substantial body of fan-created content that existed outside and often in significant tension with the show's own content and intent. The regular categories of fan-created content, fan fiction, fan art, fan animation, fan theory videos, all existed in substantial quantities, and some portion of that content depicted the show's characters in ways that were adult in various senses of the word, some of those senses involving explicit material. The show was nominally a children's program. Its characters, to the extent characters in animated shows have a defined age, were coded as young adults. The fan community that produced adult content featuring these characters was a fan community of adults producing content for adults on platforms with age restrictions that were notionally enforced. The show's production team had nothing directly to do with this content, and the controversy around it does not, strictly speaking, belong to the show, in the same way that a production decision belongs to the show. But the controversy is part of the show's story because it reflects the show's particular cultural position. The show occupied a space between children's and adult content in a way that made the fan community around it unusual, and the expectations of different segments of that fan community were in some cases incompatible. The parents who put their children in front of regular show, and the adults who developed sophisticated theories about its mythology, and the adults who created content that extended the show into explicitly adult territory were all part of the same fan ecosystem, and the frictions between those groups were real and documented. The production team's response to the existence of adult fan content was, from the available public record, essentially a non-response. They neither acknowledged it nor publicly addressed it. This is standard practice for animation production teams, who are generally advised by their legal and PR departments to maintain distance from fan-created content to avoid any implication that they are endorsing or producing it. The silence should not be read as approval or disapproval. It was professional distance. What it does mean is that the show navigated its dual audience status without ever publicly working through the implications of that status, and the fan content controversy is one of the places where the implications were most visible. Let me address the voice acting controversies, because they are part of the show's record, even if they are less prominent than the content controversies. Regular show used a core cast of voice actors across its entire run, and several of these actors were also writers or producers on the show, which created a level of creative integration that was unusual in animation, and that contributed to the show's distinctive voice. J.G. Quintel himself voiced Mordecai, William Salyers voiced Rigby, Sam Marin voiced Pops, Benson, and Muscle Man, which is a remarkable range for a single performer. Mark Hamill, who needs no introduction, had a recurring role in the show's later seasons. The controversies around the voice acting are not about performance quality. They are about specific incidents and associations that the fan community engaged with. The most prominent involves Mark Hamill's presence in the show's later seasons, specifically in the context of the show's most serious content. Hamill is associated for most of the audience primarily with his Star Wars and other science fiction and superhero roles, and his casting in a children's animated show in a role that required him to deliver emotionally serious content was something that attracted significant attention and discussion. The discussion was not consistently positive. Some critics felt that the casting was a distraction, that the audience's familiarity with Hamill from other contexts made it difficult to settle into the character he was playing. Hamill's fans disagreed sharply, arguing that the performance was strong and that his range was being underestimated. The debate was civil by internet standards and did not generate formal controversy in the way that content complaints generate formal controversy, but it is part of the show's story. There were also conversations, primarily within the animation industry and in fan communities, that followed the industry closely, about the show's use of celebrity voice casting in certain guest roles, and whether that casting served the show or distracted from it. This is a conversation that happens with essentially every animated show that uses celebrity guest voices, and Regular Show was no exception. The consensus among fans who have revisited the show's guest casting is that the quality varied significantly, with some guest appearances integrating seamlessly into the show's texture, and others creating the distraction that the critics predicted. I want to spend some time on the merchandise and commercial side of the show's story, because this is an area where the controversy was real and has not received the attention it deserves. Regular show merchandise was produced and sold throughout the show's run, and a significant portion of that merchandise was aimed at the adult fan base rather than at children. This is not unusual for an animated show with a dual audience, and the merchandise was entirely legal and above board. But the specific content of some merchandise items, the specific ways in which the show's adult-oriented humor and sensibility were translated into physical products, created a situation where products nominally associated with a children's show were being sold in ways and in contexts that were oriented toward adults. The line between merchandise designed for adult fans of a children's show and merchandise that is simply inappropriate for children is not always clear, and some of the regular show merchandise occupied the ambiguous territory near that line. Parent advocacy groups noted this, and there were complaints to both the network and to the retailers who carried the products. The response was generally that the merchandise was clearly labeled as being for adult collectors and was sold in contexts appropriate for that market. This is a legitimate response, but it does not fully resolve the issue, which is that the existence of adult-oriented merchandise associated with a children's television show creates a kind of brand confusion. The children who watch the show are aware that adults also engage with the show. Because they can see the merchandise, the message that some portion of the show's commercial presence is not aimed at them is not always clearly communicated. This is a systemic issue in animation marketing, and not one that Regular Show created or could have resolved unilaterally, but it is part of the show's commercial context. There is also the issue of the show's video game adaptations, which were produced across its run at varying levels of quality, and which in some cases contained content that was reviewed independently from the show's broadcast content, and that was held to somewhat different standards. The video game content is generally less scrutinized than the broadcast content, and some of the regular show video game adaptations contained elements that were more intense than what would have been permitted in the broadcast episodes. This has been noted by players and critics, though the level of controversy it generated was modest relative to the broadcast content controversies. Let us talk about the show's engagement with contemporary politics and social issues, because this is an area that the show navigated carefully, and that is worth examining. Regular Show was produced during a period of significant political polarization in the United States, and like most children's animation from this period, it largely avoided direct political content. The show was set in a world that was recognizably American, but that did not map onto any specific political moment. And the social issues it engaged with were handled through metaphor and through character, rather than through direct commentary. But the show's sensibility was not politically neutral. The show's sympathy, the direction of its identification and care, was clearly oriented toward people who were young and struggling, toward people who were working class, toward people who were marked as different from a mainstream norm. The workers at the park are not privileged. They are managing. The world they move through is one that was not built with them in mind, and that does not always accommodate them. The show's humor, at its most pointed, is about the gap between the way institutions and authority structures present themselves and the reality of how they function for the people inside them. This is a political sensibility, even if it is not a party political sensibility. And it generated over the show's run a modest but real controversy among viewers who found the show's implicit politics objectionable or who felt that a children's show should not have politics at all. The show never engaged with this criticism directly. It did not adjust its sensibility in response to it. The implicit politics remained consistent throughout, and the show seems to have been comfortable with the controversy they generated. The show's stance on environmental questions deserves a sentence or two in this context. The park is the show's primary setting, and the care and maintenance of the park, the physical labor of groundskeeping and lawn maintenance and cleaning and repair, is the specific texture of the characters' daily lives. The show treats this labor with genuine respect. The park is not just a backdrop, it is a place that matters, a place that the characters protect and maintain and are shaped by in return. The show's relationship with natural space, however fantastical the park's specific nature, is one of genuine affection, and the episodes that involve threats to the park are among the show's most emotionally resonant. Whether this constitutes an environmental politics in any meaningful sense is debatable, but it is part of the show's texture, and it is part of what makes the show's world feel like a place worth caring about. Let me come back to the production controversies and address something I mentioned earlier in passing, but did not fully develop. The show's relationship with the network's creative development process, and the ways that process shaped the show's evolution. Regular Show was developed through Cartoon Network's normal pilot and development pipeline, which in the late 2000s and early 2010s was in a state of significant internal change. The network was moving through a period of creative transition that would eventually produce not only Regular Show, but also Adventure Time, Steven Universe, and a cluster of other shows that represented a new kind of children's animation. The development environment was one that encouraged experimentation more than it had in preceding years, and Quintel's pitch for Regular Show was received in that context. But encouragement for experimentation does not mean unlimited creative freedom, and the development process involved significant negotiation between Quintel's vision for the show and the network's commercial and content requirements. The specific content of those negotiations is not fully documented in public sources, and I will not invent specifics I do not have. But the general shape of what was and was not possible is visible in the show itself, in the places where the show's ambitions are evident and in the places where they are curtailed. One area where the negotiation is visible is the show's treatment of romantic and sexual content. The show is set in a world of young adults with romantic lives, and the emotional reality of those romantic lives was something the writing team clearly wanted to engage with honestly. The show does engage with romantic feelings seriously and with real depth. What it does not do is engage with any of the physical aspects of romantic life in any direct way, because that was simply not available in the format. The physical affection between characters in Regular Show is limited to what a children's network standard permits, which means it is limited to hand-holding and, eventually, and the show navigates this limitation by investing all of the emotional weight that might otherwise be distributed across a fuller depiction of adult relationship into the specific moments of contact that are permitted. This concentration of emotional weight has the effect of making those moments feel extraordinarily significant, which is appropriate to the character's experience, because for young people in early romantic relationships, those moments are extraordinarily significant. The limitation imposed by the format turns out to serve the content rather than restraining it. This is not always the case with content limitations, but it is here. There were conversations, documented informally in accounts from people who worked on the show, about episodes that pushed at the edges of this limitation in various ways. About approaches to depicting the physical reality of the characters' adult lives that were proposed and negotiated and modified. The results of these negotiations are what we see in the show, and they represent a consistent creative response to constraint. If you cannot show the thing directly, find a way to make the emotional truth of the thing present through what you can show. I want to address the show's engagement with the legacy of animation that came before it, because this is another area where the controversies were real and are worth examining. Regular Show was made by people who had grown up with and loved a specific tradition of American television animation. And that love is visible throughout the show's run, in its references, in its aesthetic choices, in the specific cartoons and shows and movies that it invokes. The show is deeply literate in animation history, and that literacy is part of its texture in the same way that its musical literacy is part of its texture. But being deeply literate in a tradition also means inheriting that tradition's problems. The animation that Regular Show loved was, in some respects, animation that had not fully resolved questions about representation and stereotype and inclusion. And some of what the show inherited was not just the parts it should have inherited. The early season's humor in certain areas, the ways in which certain characters were coded as funny through their physical difference, the ways in which certain cultural groups were represented through shorthand, these did not arise from nowhere. They arose from a tradition that had always used these tools, and the show used them without always asking whether it should. This is a legitimate criticism, and it has been made by critics who are not interested in condemning the show, but who are interested in being precise about what it was doing. The show's relationship with the tradition it inherited is, in this reading, simultaneously admiring and uncritical. And the uncritical element produced content that the show probably could and should have done better. The show's evolution in this area is real, and it is similar to the evolution I described earlier with the male friendship coding. The show got better at the things it was getting wrong over time, and the trajectory of that improvement was visible in the work. The question of whether the improvement was fast enough or complete enough is one that different critics answered differently, and I do not think there is a single right answer. Let us talk about the show's animation style and the controversies that arose from specific visual choices, because this is an area that is genuinely interesting and that I have not addressed yet. Regular Show's animation style is distinctive and was widely praised at the time of the show's production, and continues to be appreciated. It is clean and bold and specific, with a character design vocabulary that is immediately recognizable and that works across an enormous range of visual situations. The show created hundreds of different characters across its run, and the design work on those characters is consistently high quality, maintaining a visual coherence across the whole that is not easy to achieve. But the style also made certain choices that generated responses ranging from appreciation to criticism. The show's visual design for characters who were coded as threatening or villainous has a specific vocabulary that critics have noted draws on visual conventions that are not always neutral in terms of their cultural associations. The way certain characters are designed to read as scary or wrong or dangerous sometimes aligns with visual conventions that have problematic histories in animation and in broader visual culture. Conventions that associated darkness or distortion with threat in ways that carry racial or cultural baggage. This is a subtle and difficult area to address, precisely because the visual conventions in question are genuinely widespread and deeply embedded in the history of the medium, and the show's use of them may have been entirely unreflective. But the unreflectiveness is itself a form of the problem, and the fact that the show received criticism for these visual choices in a sustained way across its run is worth acknowledging. The show also made visual choices that were specifically criticized for being too intense for children, separate from the content controversies. Certain character designs, particularly for the supernatural threats the show depicted, were created with a level of visual detail and with specific visual conventions borrowed from horror that resulted in designs that were genuinely frightening in a way that went beyond what the show's overall aesthetic would have led a viewer to anticipate. Parents who encountered these designs through merchandise or through their children's descriptions, or through watching the relevant episodes, were in some cases surprised by the intensity. The show's response to these criticisms was consistent. The visual style was part of the show's deliberate aesthetic, the horror elements were integral to the story the show was telling, and the network had reviewed and approved the content. This is a defensible position, but the criticism is also defensible, and the fact that the visual intensity of certain elements surprised audiences is itself a form of communication failure, a failure to prepare viewers for what they were going to encounter. I want to take time to address something that is not usually included in discussions of the show's controversies, but that is I think, genuinely part of its story. The controversy around the show's ending in terms of what it did and did not do for each of its main characters. The finale of regular show gave extensive attention to several characters and relatively little to others, and the balance of that attention has been discussed and contested since the finale aired. Skips, for example, is one of the show's most beloved characters and one of its most philosophically interesting, a being who is immortal and who has spent that immortality in service of a community rather than in the pursuit of anything larger. And his finale resolution was felt by many fans to be insufficient given everything the show had built with him. The show addressed his immortality and his grief and his relationship with the friends he was going to outlive, but in ways that some fans found perfunctory compared to the depth the show had established in those themes. Pops, as I discussed, received the most extensive finale attention because he was the character whose arc the finale was built around. The depth of attention given to his ending was part of what generated the emotional response the finale did, but it also meant that the time given to him was time not available for other characters. Benson's finale resolution was broadly appreciated because the show had spent significant time across its final seasons developing him into a full character, and the finale honored that development with a clean and earned resolution. His relationship with his employees, particularly with Mordecai and Rigby, arrived at something that felt like genuine warmth, rather than the resignation or affection as management that the early seasons had suggested, and the finale's treatment of this was widely praised. Mordecai's finale resolution, as I discussed at length earlier, was the source of the most sustained controversy. I will not repeat that analysis, but I want to add one element that I think is important. The controversy around Mordecai's ending is partly a controversy about what the show thought it was doing with his romantic arc, and the answer the finale gave to that question was not the one a large part of the audience had been anticipating. The show seemed, in the finale, to be saying that Mordecai's romantic arc was about his growth rather than about any particular relationship. That the person who existed in the epilogue had grown through the experiences with Margaret and CJ and had become capable of something he had not been capable of before. And that the unnamed back character was evidence of that growth rather than a new character the audience needed to know. If that was the intent, it was an intent that required the audience to have a specific relationship to the emotional material, to have been following Mordecai's growth rather than his specific romantic choices, and to be satisfied with the evidence of growth without needing the full emotional resolution of the specific questions the show had raised. Not everyone was watching the show that way. Many viewers were watching it as a love story, one that had invested significant narrative capital in specific relationships, and for those viewers, the ending was not a resolution of the love story but a bypass of it. Both readings are legitimate. The show supported both of them across its run, but only one of them was satisfied by the finale. Let me address the merchandise controversy I mentioned earlier in more detail, specifically the controversy around the video game released in conjunction with the show's run. Regular show had a significant video game presence, with games released on multiple platforms across the show's run. Some of these games were well reviewed and well received. Others were less so, but the controversy I am referring to is not about quality. It is about content. Specifically about the content of a game that contained elements that were more intense in their depiction of violence than what would have been permitted in the broadcast show. And that reached players who were younger than the game's nominal target audience through the same mechanisms that allowed young people to access any digital game. The game's age rating was appropriate for its content by the standards of the rating system under which it was assessed. But the rating system operates at a level of abstraction that does not always prevent young children from playing games rated for older players, particularly when those games are associated with a show that young children watch. The specific content that was more intense than the broadcast show's content involved combat sequences and enemy design that drew on the show's horror vocabulary and extended it into interactive form in ways that the show's own content review process would not have permitted. The complaints that arose from this were directed at both the game's publisher and at Cartoon Network, and the response was that the game had been rated appropriately and that the responsibility for age-appropriate game access rested with parents and retailers. This is a standard and defensible response, but it did not satisfy the parents who had made what they believed was a reasonable inference that a game associated with a children's show was appropriate for children. Now let me address something that has been waiting throughout this whole conversation, which is the question of the show's final position in the culture and what the controversies add up to. Regular show ended in 2017. It has been nearly a decade. The show is available on streaming platforms and is widely watched, particularly by people who were children when it aired, and who are now young adults discovering what they were watching. The perspective of time has been, on balance, generous to the show. Many of the content controversies that were sharp at the time of broadcast have softened, because the context of children's animation has shifted, and because the things the show was doing now seem less transgressive and more like the natural form of the medium. The emotional honesty that felt controversial in the show's time now looks like the foundation for an enormous amount of animation that followed. The things that have not softened with time are the structural issues I described earlier. The show's relationship with its female characters, its use of certain visual conventions, its early season's humor in certain registers, these have not been redeemed by the passage of time. They stand in the record as things the show did that it should have done differently. Things that were not inevitable, things that were choices, and that had real effects on real viewers who deserved better. The balance of this record is, I think, clearly positive. Regular Show did more that was right than wrong, more that was genuinely good than genuinely harmful. And the things it did right had effects that are still visible in the animation landscape a decade later. But the positive balance does not erase the negative entries, and a serious account of the show requires being honest about both. What I find most interesting about the controversies, taken as a whole, is that almost none of them involve the show doing something carelessly or cynically. Almost every controversy in this show's record comes from the show trying to do something, from the show reaching towards something that it believed was worth reaching for, and either overreaching or reaching in a direction that needed to be more carefully considered. This is a different kind of failure from pure carelessness, and it produces a different kind of accounting. A show that fails because it was trying to do something difficult is a show that tells you something about the difficulty of the thing it was trying to do. The controversies around Regular Show are partly a record of what children's animation cannot do, partly a record of what it can do if someone is willing to fight for it, and partly a record of the specific shape of a particular creative team's ambitions and their partial fulfillment. That is a richer record than a show that had no controversies at all, and a richer record than a show that had controversies because it was simply careless. The show produced something lasting. The show changed things. And the controversies are part of how it changed them, because change in a system that is not inclined to change requires friction, and the show created friction consistently. And in most cases, there is one more thing I want to cover before we get to the outro, which is the show's own relationship to controversy within its narrative, because this is something the show engaged with directly and somewhat metatextually in a few episodes. Regular Show made several episodes that are, if you read them closely, about the experience of making content that pushes against institutional limits. Episodes in which characters create something they believe in and are told it goes too far. Episodes in which the tension between creative ambition and the constraints of context is dramatized in ways that have a clear parallel to the show's own production experience. These episodes tend to resolve in the direction of the creative ambition being vindicated, at least partially, because they are made by people who believed their ambition was being vindicated through the show itself. They are optimistic about the possibility of making difficult work within constraining systems. This self-reflexive quality is one of the things that makes Regular Show genuinely interesting as an object of study as well as an object of enjoyment. The show was aware of its own position. It knew what it was doing and where it was doing it, and it made work that addressed that position rather than simply occupying it. The controversies were not something that happened to the show from outside. They were, in a real sense, something the show invited and engaged with and used. That is, in the end, a form of creative courage. And it is the thing I want to leave you with. The show was brave. Not always right, not always skillful, not always fair to everyone it depicted or everyone in its audience. But brave in the specific sense of making things that were going to cause problems, and making them anyway, because the alternative was making something smaller and safer and less true. And that was never what the show was going to do. 8 seasons, 261 episodes. A generation of viewers whose sense of what animation could be was formed by what this show was willing to be. The park is closed now, the characters have moved on to the places the epilogue showed them moving toward. The controversies are in the record, and the show itself is there to watch, with all of its complications and all of its beauty whenever you need it. Thanks for being here tonight. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.